On a freezing night, a man heard an unexpected knock at his door. But when he looked outside, he was stunned. A mother tiger and her 3 shivering cubs stood in the snow, begging for help. What happened next changed everything. Before we continue, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more incredible stories like this to life. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. If you love heartwarming and thought-provoking stories about the bond between humans and nature, this is the place for you. Now let's dive back into this unforgettable story. James Miller had lived in his cabin for years, tucked away deep in the Colorado wilderness. He had seen brutal winters before, but nothing like this. The cold was unlike anything he had ever felt, sharp, merciless, and endless. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, shaking the trees and piling snow so high against his door that he had to push hard just to check the storm's progress. The sky was a dull, lifeless gray, and the sun, if it was even there, felt too weak to make a difference. Inside, James sat near the fire, a thick wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His breath still fogged up in the air. Even with the fire roaring, the cold crept into the walls, into his bones. Then he heard a knock. His brows pulled together in confusion. No one ever came this far into the wilderness, not in this weather. The nearest town was miles away, and he hadn't seen another soul in weeks. He stood up cautiously, grabbing the old rifle he kept leaning against the wall. Not because he wanted to use it, just in case. Moving toward the window, he wiped away the frost with his sleeve. What he saw made his heart nearly stop. A tigress stood at his doorstep, her thick orange fur coated in snow. Her massive frame looked powerful, but it was her eyes that caught him, golden, desperate, pleading. And at her feet, 3 small cubs huddled together, shaking violently. Then the mother tiger did something that made James's breath catch in his throat. She raised a paw and knocked on the door again. Not scratching, not roaring, knocking. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she lifted her paws together in a slow, deliberate motion. Like she was begging. James's grip tightened on the rifle, but his heart pounded for an entirely different reason. He had always believed wild animals acted on instinct alone. But now, staring into the eyes of this mother tiger, he wasn't so sure. James stepped back from the window, his mind racing. A tiger, an actual tiger, was knocking on his door, asking for help. He had spent years in these woods, living alone, learning the ways of nature. He respected the wild. And he had always believed that the wild did not ask for favors. But this was different. His breath fogged up the glass as he watched the tigress nudge one of her cubs forward. The smallest of the 3 barely moved, its tiny body weak and trembling in the snow. Was it dying? A lump formed in James's throat. If I don't help, those cubs won't make it. But helping meant inviting danger into his home. A full-grown tiger, one that could kill him in seconds, was standing just outside his door. What if this was a trap? What if she changed her mind the moment he let his guard down? His fingers hovered over the doorknob. The rational part of him screamed, "Don't open the door. It's a wild animal." But something deeper, something instinctive whispered, "She trusts you." James's eyes met the tigress's through the frosted glass. She wasn't snarling. She wasn't pacing or growling. She was just waiting. Finally, with a deep breath, he reached for the latch and slowly pulled the door open. A rush of icy wind hit his face, stealing his breath, but he barely noticed. The tigress did not charge inside. She did not bare her teeth or make any move to harm him. Instead, she gently lifted her smallest cub in her powerful jaws and placed it just inside the doorway. Then she stepped back. She stood still, her golden eyes watching him, waiting. It was almost as if she was asking for permission. James's chest tightened. This wasn't just an animal. This was a mother, desperate to save her young. And she had chosen to trust him. James stood frozen, his heart pounding as the tigress stepped cautiously over the threshold. One by one, she guided her cubs inside. The 2 stronger ones trotted in on shaky legs, their fur dusted with snow. The smallest one, the one she had placed at the door first, barely moved. James barely breathed as he watched the mother tiger move. Every step was careful, deliberate. She wasn't just some wild beast. She was a mother, protecting the most precious things in her world. She didn't panic. She didn't growl or pace. Instead, she curled her striped tail around her cubs, pulling them close in the dim glow of the fire. James swallowed hard and quickly grabbed a few thick blankets. He laid them near the fireplace, where the heat would be strongest. For a moment, the tigress simply watched him, her golden eyes unreadable. Then, to his amazement, she gently nudged her cubs toward the blankets. James stood in stunned silence as she lowered her head and began licking their tiny faces. She was keeping them warm, caring for them. The two stronger cubs nestled into the fabric, their little bodies relaxing for the first time since arriving. The smallest cub, weak but alive, twitched slightly, its fur damp from the snow that still clung to it. James knelt down, his movements slow and careful. He reached out and adjusted the blanket around the tiny cub's frail body. The tigress didn't stop him. She simply watched, her whiskers twitching slightly, her massive paws resting protectively beside her young. Then something even more incredible happened. As James pulled the blanket snugly around the smallest cub, the tigress let out a low, deep sound. Not a growl, not a warning, something else, something almost grateful. James's breath caught in his throat. Was she thanking him? The two stronger cubs snuggled closer to their mother, their tiny bodies rising and falling with slow, tired breaths. The warmth of the fire had begun to chase away the cold, but the smallest cub still lay weak and unmoving. James's eyes flickered to the mother tiger. She watched him, her golden gaze steady but calm. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't defensive. She was waiting. James swallowed and turned toward the old iron stove in the corner. His hands moved instinctively, grabbing an old kettle and filling it with milk. Warm, not hot. He poured the milk into a shallow bowl, the scent filling the small cabin. Then he hesitated. Would she allow this? Would she see it as a threat? Slowly, carefully, James placed the bowl near the cubs and stepped back. The mother tiger lowered her great head and sniffed the milk. The room fell into a heavy silence. Then, to his astonishment, she gently nudged the bowl toward her cubs. James exhaled, only now realizing he had been holding his breath. He had just witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just survival, this was trust. The two stronger cubs lapped at the milk eagerly, their tiny tongues flicking against the surface. The smallest cub stirred weakly, its nose twitching. James knew what this meant. They had reached a silent agreement. He would help her cubs. She would trust him. But as James sat back against the wall, watching the mother tiger curl around her young, a single question gnawed at his mind. What would happen when morning came? Outside, the storm raged on, howling through the trees and shaking the cabin's walls. The wind screamed like a living thing, battering the wooden structure with relentless fury. Snow piled high against the windows, threatening to seal them inside. Inside, however, a different kind of storm had settled, one of quiet, unspoken trust. James pulled his blanket tighter around himself, watching as the tigress curled her massive body protectively around her cubs. She was their shield, their warmth, their guardian. Every now and then, she lowered her head to lick the weakest cub, nudging it gently, urging it to stay awake. James could see the exhaustion in her golden eyes, the way her breathing had slowed, her muscles finally relaxing after what must have been an endless fight against the cold. How long had she been wandering through the snow, searching for help? How many times had she almost given up? James's fingers tightened around the blanket. She had risked everything to knock on his door. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, listening to the crackling fire and the slow, steady breathing of the animals. A part of him knew this was insane. He was trapped in his own home with a family of tigers. And yet, for some reason, he wasn't afraid. The tigress had done nothing to harm him. She had entered his home not as a predator, but as a mother. She had placed her trust in him, and now he had to do the same. His eyelids grew heavy. The warmth of the fire, the rhythmic breathing of the cubs, and the exhaustion of the night all pulled him toward sleep. Just before he drifted off, his vision blurred, but he saw something incredible. The tigress, still watching him, lowered her great head ever so slightly. A bow, a gesture of trust, a silent acknowledgement between two beings, one human, one wild, who had somehow, against all odds, come to an understanding. And then the night took him. James woke to a soft, golden glow filtering through the frosted windows. The storm had passed. The howling wind was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence, the kind that only comes after nature has spent its fury. For a brief moment he forgot about the night before. But then he heard it, a low, steady purring. His eyes snapped open. The tigress lay stretched out near the fireplace, her striped body relaxed, her breathing slow and steady. Her cubs were nestled safely against her warm fur, tiny bodies rising and falling in peaceful sleep. James's gaze drifted to the smallest one. The cub he had feared wouldn't survive the night. It was moving. Its tiny paws twitched as it dreamed, its little chest rising and falling, no longer stiff with cold. James let out a slow sigh of relief. It had made it. Carefully, he sat up, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. He stretched, rolling his shoulders, trying not to disturb the quiet peace that had settled over the room. The tigress lifted her head slightly, watching him. She wasn't tense. She wasn't afraid. She was simply observing. James met her gaze, holding it for a few long moments. Then, slowly, he stood and moved toward the stove. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the warmth spreading through his fingers as he wrapped them around the metal mug. He took a slow sip, glancing back at his unexpected guests. A mother tiger and her 3 cubs, asleep by his fire. How did this happen? How had a wild tiger, one of nature's most powerful predators, known to come to his door? The question echoed in his mind, but there was no answer. Only the soft crackling of the fire. Only the gentle rise and fall of the cubs' tiny chests. Only the golden winter sun creeping higher in the sky, bringing light to a world forever changed. The weakest cub stirred, a tiny shiver running through its fragile body. Its fur was no longer stiff with cold, but it still looked so small, so fragile. Blinking up at James with sleepy, unfocused eyes, it let out a small, pitiful sound. A soft mew, barely louder than a whisper. James's heart clenched. Slowly he knelt down, careful not to make any sudden movements. He reached for the bowl of milk he had warmed earlier and gently pushed it toward the cub. The mother tiger watched him closely, her golden eyes sharp and alert, but she didn't move to stop him. She was waiting. The tiny cub lay there for a moment, its body still sluggish. James held his breath. Then, with great effort, the cub lifted its head. Its little pink tongue flicked out, lapping weakly at the milk. James let out a slow breath and smiled. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning. The other 2 cubs, full of restored energy, tumbled over each other, their small bodies rolling across the wooden floor. They pounced and batted at each other's tails, letting out tiny chuffs of excitement. Their mother watched them with quiet patience, her massive body still but her tail flicking gently. James couldn't help but marvel at her. She was a predator, a wild creature made of muscle and instinct, but before anything else, she was a mother. A mother who had fought against impossible odds to save her cubs. And somehow, in this strange, quiet moment, inside a tiny wooden cabin buried in the frozen Montana wilderness, they had become a family. James took a sip of his now cold coffee, his thoughts heavy. But this couldn't last forever. At some point, they would have to leave. Would they find safety in the wild? Would the cubs survive without this warmth, this shelter? And when they did leave, would he ever see them again? The day passed in a quiet rhythm. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with warmth, but something had changed. The tigress had begun to stir restlessly. She paced near the door, her movements slow but deliberate. Her tail flicked, her ears twitching at the faint sounds of the forest beyond. She glanced at the windows, then at the door. James followed her gaze. Outside, the world had been transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of untouched white, the snow glittering beneath the pale winter sun. He exhaled. He knew what this meant. "She's ready to go," he whispered to himself. The mother tiger turned to face him, her golden eyes steady and unreadable. Then slowly she nudged her cubs, urging them to stand. The smallest one hesitated. Its tiny legs trembled as it tried to rise, but this time it didn't fall. It stayed on its feet. James knelt down, his breath curling in the cold air. He reached out, stopping just short of touching the little cub. "You're strong now," he murmured. "You're going to be okay." The tigress let out a soft, chuffing sound, a low rumbling that vibrated through the air. James didn't know why, but he felt like it was a whisper of thanks. His chest tightened. This was it. Slowly, he stepped back and grasped the door handle. The wood was cold beneath his fingers as he pulled it open. A gust of icy air rushed in, swirling snow around his feet. But the tigress didn't bolt. She stood in the doorway, her cubs gathered close, her body still for a long, lingering moment. Then she turned. With sure, steady steps, she led her cubs into the wilderness. James stood there watching, his breath fogging in the cold air. He didn't move until they disappeared into the trees, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood something. Wild animals weren't just beasts. They had hearts, they had souls, and sometimes they knew exactly who to trust. The silence was deafening. James sat near the fire, staring at the empty space where the tigers had slept just hours before. The warmth of their presence had faded, but the memory lingered. The crackling fire cast long shadows across the wooden floor, flickering over the blankets that still lay crumpled where the cubs had curled up. It was strange how quickly a space could feel full, and then so empty. Had he imagined it? Had it all been some impossible dream? James rubbed his hands over his face, trying to shake off the feeling of unreality. It was hard to believe that just yesterday he had been alone in this cabin, going about his normal life. And then a tiger had knocked on his door. His eyes drifted toward the door, the same door he had held open as they left. Something caught his eye. James stood slowly, crossing the cabin with quiet, careful steps. Just outside, in the fresh snow, a single paw print remained. It was perfectly preserved. Large, strong, undeniable. James crouched down, brushing his fingertips over the edge of the print. The snow was still crisp, the mark fresh, real. It hadn't been a dream. He exhaled slowly, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. Loss, wonder, something else he couldn't quite name. James straightened up and looked out toward the tree line, half expecting to see a flash of orange and black. But the forest was still, the snow-covered branches swaying gently in the wind. They were gone. But they had been here. And the quiet, empty cabin, the single paw print in the snow, would always remind him. A reminder of the night a tiger knocked on his door. James stood at his doorstep, his breath curling in the cold air, staring at the single paw print left behind. The mark in the snow was already beginning to fade as the wind swept across the ground, but it was still there, a final trace of the tigress and her cubs. He lifted his gaze to the vast, snow-covered landscape stretching before him. The world was empty and quiet. They were gone. Yet something inside him had changed. For years, James had thought of wild animals as just that, wild. He had admired them from a distance, respected their power, but never once believed they could be understood. But now he knew better. He had seen the tigress as desperation, her silent plea for help. He had watched her patience, the way she had controlled her instincts, the way she had trusted him, and against all reason, she had known. She knew, James thought, gripping the doorframe. She knew I wouldn't hurt them. The wind howled through the trees, breaking his thoughts. The Montana winter was far from over, and James had work to do. With a sigh, he turned back inside, shutting the door against the cold. But the silence in the cabin felt different now. Not empty, just waiting. Later, as he chopped wood, checked his food supply, and shoveled snow off his roof, his mind kept drifting back. Back to the soft weight of the cubs against his blankets. Back to the sound of the tigress's deep, steady breathing by the fire. Back to the moment she had turned to look at him one last time before disappearing into the trees. Would he ever see them again? James didn't know, but as he glanced toward the tree line, watching the shadows shift in the late afternoon sun, he hoped. The following days passed in a blur of routine. James kept himself busy, hunting, gathering firewood, checking his food supplies, reinforcing the cabin against the bitter Montana winter. His hands worked through the familiar motions, but his mind was elsewhere. Something felt off. It wasn't fear, exactly. He had lived in the wilderness long enough to recognize danger, and this wasn't it. It was something else, a presence, a feeling. Whenever he stepped outside, an odd sensation crept up his spine, like an unseen gaze pressing against him. He would pause, scanning the trees, listening to the wind. But every time he turned, there was nothing, only silence. Only the snow-covered forest, untouched and undisturbed. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. At night, as he sat by the fire with a book in hand, his eyes would drift toward the window. The darkness beyond the glass seemed heavier somehow, as if something was just out of sight, waiting. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew better. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, he saw it. Far in the distance, just beyond the tree line, a flash of orange. James's breath hitched. The movement was brief, barely there, a flicker of color against the endless white. It could have been the last rays of sunlight catching on the snow. It could have been nothing, but somehow he knew. His heart pounded against his ribs. She came back. James stood at the window, his breath slow, steady, barely daring to move. Outside, the shape in the distance remained still, blending into the snowy woods as if it were merely part of the landscape. But it wasn't. He knew that shape. Then, ever so slowly, the tigress stepped forward. His pulse quickened as she emerged from the shadows of the trees, her massive paws pressing into the fresh snow, leaving a trail behind her. She moved with the same quiet grace as before, but this time something was different. She wasn't alone. Behind her, 3 small figures followed, stronger now, their movements more sure. The cubs had grown. James exhaled, a strange warmth spreading through his chest, despite the icy air creeping in through the cracks in the cabin. She had left, but not forever. She had survived. She had returned. The mother tiger stopped a short distance from the cabin, her golden eyes catching the last light of the setting sun. The cubs lingered close to her, their playful curiosity tempered by the stillness of the moment. James pressed his palm against the cold window pane, his throat tight with something he couldn't quite name. He knew she wouldn't come inside this time. She didn't need to. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a plea for help. It was something else. For a long moment, the tigress simply watched him. There was no fear in her gaze, no hesitation, just understanding. Then, without a sound, she turned, her striped tail flicking behind her. The cubs followed, their small bodies moving in perfect rhythm with their mothers. James watched as they disappeared, swallowed by the vast white wilderness. His chest ached, not with sadness, but with something more profound. She had come back, just to say goodbye. A wild, silent farewell. That night, James sat by the fire, staring into the dancing flames, his mind far away. He thought of the tigress, standing just beyond the tree line, her golden eyes catching the last light of the setting sun. He thought of the 3 cubs, no longer weak and shivering, but strong, playful, full of life. She hadn't come to him because she needed help. She had come to show him. Of all the places she could have gone, she came back here. The thought filled him with something deep and unshakable. James had spent years in these mountains, alone, but never lonely. He had lived alongside nature, respecting its dangers, marveling at its beauty. But in all that time, he had never felt anything quite like this. A connection. Not one built on words or logic, but on something older, something deeper. Wild animals didn't speak like humans. They didn't shake hands, or write letters, or say thank you. But James had learned something far greater. They understood. The tigress had trusted him with her cubs when they were at their weakest. And now she had returned. Not because she needed anything, but simply to let him know, we're okay now. It wasn't a farewell in the way humans would say it, but it was just as clear. James leaned back in his chair, listening to the crackle of the fire. For years he had believed nature existed on one side and people on the other, that wild creatures and humans could never truly understand each other. But now, he wasn't so sure. Sometimes if you listened closely enough, you could hear them. James never expected anyone to believe what had happened. For years, he had lived alone in the mountains, speaking to more trees than people. The town was a place he visited only when necessary, to stock up on supplies, trade for what he couldn't make himself, and hear the occasional news from the outside world. So when he stepped into the small general store one morning, the last thing he expected was to hear whispers about a tiger. At the back of the store, near the shelves lined with canned goods, 2 men stood talking in hushed voices. "Did you hear about the tiger sighting?" one of them said. James's hand froze on a bag of flour. "Tiger? Here?" The other man scoffed. "That's what folks are saying," the first man continued. "A mother tiger, spotted not far from here, with her cubs in tow." James's heart pounded. "Impossible," the second man said. "Tigers don't act like that. If they were starving, maybe they'd come closer to people. But this one, it wasn't hunting, wasn't causing trouble, just watching." "Yeah," the first man said, his voice dropping lower. "But the tracks tell a different story." James exhaled slowly. So others had seen her. He had no doubt the tigress was still out there, roaming the vast wilderness, teaching her cubs how to survive. She had left something behind. Not just a trail of paw prints in the snow, but a story. one that people would struggle to believe, one that would make them question what they thought they knew about wild animals. James didn't say a word. He just paid for his supplies, pulled his coat tighter against the cold, and walked back toward his cabin. As he stepped outside, he glanced toward the distant tree line, where the snow stretched untouched for miles. Somewhere out there, she was watching. James smiled. Let them wonder, he thought. Winter lingered, stretching its icy fingers across the land. Snow piled high against the trees, the rivers froze solid, and the nights were long and unforgiving. James had weathered many winters in these mountains, but this one felt different. Every time the wind howled against his cabin, rattling the windows, he thought of her. The tigress. Where was she now? Had she found shelter deep within the forest, nestled in some hidden cave, her cubs curled up beside her? Had they grown strong enough to survive the harshest nights? James often found himself staring out into the endless white, scanning the horizon for a familiar streak of orange. But the tigress never returned, not in the way she had before. Still, he knew she was out there. She was a survivor. He remembered the night she had come to his door, desperate yet controlled, trusting him with her cubs. It had been an act of pure instinct, of deep understanding, one that defied everything he thought he knew about wild animals. She had chosen him, and James still didn't know why. Maybe it didn't matter. Some things in life weren't meant to be explained, only remembered. And James knew he would never forget. Not the way she had lowered her head to him in quiet trust. Not the way her cubs had trembled against the blankets by his fire, clinging to life. Not the way she had returned, stronger, confident, only to say goodbye. The tigress had left more than just tracks in the snow. She had left a mark on him, a story that would never fade, no matter how many winters came and went. James took a slow sip of coffee, the fire crackling beside him. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the earth in a silent, endless white. And somewhere beyond the trees, a mother tiger walked through the cold, her cubs at her side. Wild, free, unforgettable. The first signs of spring came slowly, almost shyly. Snow still clung stubbornly to the earth, but the ice on the river had begun to crack, and the trees, though bare, seemed to stand a little taller, as if stretching toward the promise of warmer days. James stood on his porch, hands tucked deep in his pockets, watching the world shift around him. Winter had been long, unforgettable. And though he had spent most of it alone, he knew, in his heart, that this year had been different. Because of her. Because of the tigress who had knocked on his door. Because of the moment she had placed her trust in him. Not as a human, not as a stranger, but as something more. A protector, a part of her story. James exhaled, watching his breath curl into the crisp morning air. Then, without really thinking, he found himself walking, down the porch steps, through the clearing, to the very edge of the forest. The place where he had last seen her. The snow was thinner now, melting into patches of damp earth. Birds called softly in the distance, the first hints of life returning to the frozen land. James knelt. He pressed his palm into the cold ground, right beside a fading paw print, one of the last traces she had left behind. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he made a promise. If you ever need help again, I'll be here. He didn't know if she could hear him, didn't know if she was miles away, deep in the wilderness, or closer than he thought, watching from the shadows. But somehow he felt she already knew. Some connections didn't need words. Some bonds, no matter how impossible, were never truly broken. James stood, brushing the dampness from his hands. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his cabin, leaving behind nothing but footprints. And a promise. With spring came new life. The snow melted into rushing streams. The trees stretched their limbs toward the sky, and tiny buds of green pushed through the once frozen earth. Birds returned, filling the air with songs that had been absent for months. The forest, which had been so silent and still, began to breathe again. James spent more time outside, feeling the warmth return to the world. He chopped wood, fished by the river, and walked the familiar trails near his cabin. And he watched. Not for the tigress, necessarily, but for something. A sign, a feeling, a moment that would tell him the winter had truly been real and not just some dream carried away by the snow. Days passed, then weeks, no paw prints, no flashes of orange, nothing. Maybe she was gone for good. Maybe she had moved deeper into the mountains where the trees were thicker and the world was wilder. But then, one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet, James heard it. A sound carried on the wind. Soft, barely there. A low, familiar chuffing. James froze, his heart pounding. He knew that sound. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a growl. It was recognition. It was trust. It was a sound that said without words, "I remember you." James closed his eyes and smiled. The tigress had moved on, but she had not forgotten. James never saw the tigress up close again. As the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, the forest around him changed. The last traces of winter disappeared, replaced by fresh greenery and the hum of life. Deer moved through the trees, birds built their nests, and the river rushed with the energy of spring. But the tigress was gone. Not in the way that things are lost forever, just in the way that wild things must be. She had returned to the world she belonged to, where the trees grew thick and the mountains stretched high, where survival was a daily fight and trust was a rare, precious thing. James knew this was how it had to be. And yet, even as the seasons changed, even as summer came and then faded into autumn, he never truly felt alone. Because somewhere out there, she was still watching. He felt it in the stillness of certain mornings when the air was heavy with unspoken things. He sensed it in the rustling of leaves, in the way the wind sometimes carried an almost familiar presence. He knew without a doubt that she had not forgotten, and neither had he. James had always believed in the wild, but now he believed in something more. He believed in connection, in the silent understanding between two very different beings whose lives had crossed in the most unexpected way. He didn't need to see her again to know she was out there. And if someday she ever needed him again, she would know exactly where to go. For most of his life, James had believed in one simple rule: respect the wild, but keep your distance. It was a lesson taught by the land itself, by years of watching nature unfold from afar. He had seen predators hunt, prey flee, storms rage, and seasons change. He had learned that survival meant knowing when to step back, when to leave things untouched, and when to simply observe. But now, he understood something even greater. The tigress had shattered every expectation he had ever held about the wild. She hadn't come to him as a mindless beast, ruled only by hunger and instinct. She had come as a mother, as a creature who thought, who felt, who made a choice. She had trusted him. And trust, James realized, was the rarest thing in the world. It wasn't something easily given, not in the wild, not even among humans. It was something fragile, something earned. The tigress had risked everything to knock on his door, to ask for help, to place her cubs in his care. She had understood him in some way, and in return he had come to understand her. She had taught him that animals weren't just creatures of instinct. They felt, they thought, and sometimes they trusted. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his days. One that changed the way he saw the world. The forest would never feel the same to him again. It wasn't just a place of survival anymore. It was a place of connection. A place where the impossible could happen. A place where one cold winter night, a wild tiger had knocked on his door and changed everything. Years later, whenever James sat by his fireplace on cold winter nights, he would think back to that moment, that knock. At the time, it had seemed impossible. A wild tiger standing at his door asking for help. It had defied everything he thought he knew about nature, about survival, about the boundaries between man and beast. And yet, it had happened. The fire crackled beside him, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls of his cabin. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows just as it had that night. The memories never faded. He could still see her, the tigress, the way she had stood in the snow, her massive form outlined by the storm, the desperate yet patient look in her golden eyes, the way she had nudged her cubs inside with such gentleness, placing them in his care, as if she somehow knew he would not turn them away. James had always considered himself a man of reason, but there was something about that night that went beyond reason. At the time, it had seemed unthinkable, a wild tiger standing at his door, seeking help. It shattered everything he believed about nature, survival, and the divide between man and beast. Yet, it had happened. The fire crackled beside him, its glow flickering against the wooden walls of his cabin. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, just like it had that night. The memory remained as vivid as ever. He could still see her, the tigress, standing in the snow, her powerful frame outlined by the storm, her golden eyes filled with both desperation and patience. The way she had gently nudged her cubs inside, placing them in his care, as if she somehow knew he wouldn't turn them away. James had always been a man of logic, but that night had been something beyond logic. It was trust. Something so rare, so powerful, that it had left a permanent mark on his soul. He had not seen the tigress again, not up close. She had returned to her world, just as he remained in his. But every winter, when the snow piled high against his cabin and the wind carried the deep silence of the wilderness, he found himself listening, waiting, hoping. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind was just right, when the night was just still enough, he swore he could hear it. A distant sound carried through the cold, a soft chuff, a whisper of recognition, a reminder that though she was gone, though their paths had diverged, the bond they had formed in that one impossible moment would never truly fade. James would always remember the knock that changed everything, the night a tiger had come to his door, and the night he had chosen to open it. James's life was forever changed by the night a tiger knocked on his door. What began as an act of desperation turned into a rare and profound connection, one built on trust, understanding, and respect. The tigress had shown him that the wild was not just something to fear, but something to honor. Though she had long since disappeared into the forest, her presence never truly left him. Every winter, as the snow piled high and the wind howled through the trees, James would sit by his fire and remember. And sometimes, just sometimes, he swore he could still hear a soft chuff in the distance, a quiet echo of trust that would stay with him forever. James's story reminds us of the deep intelligence and emotions of wild animals. It challenges us to see them not just as creatures of the wilderness, but as beings capable of trust, survival, and even gratitude. Let this be a reminder that nature is not something separate from us. It is something we are a part of. Whether through conservation, awareness, or simply respecting the wildlife around us, we all have a role to play in protecting the beauty of the natural world. So, the next time you look into the eyes of an animal, wild or tame, remember James's story and ask yourself, what would you do if a tiger knocked on your door? If you like this story, why not like, share, and subscribe to this channel? Also, hit the notification bell to get notified when new videos are published.